It is my extraordinary pleasure to be in conversation today with a man that I think is easily among the most important and most talented philosophers of our time, about his new book, Democracy and Beauty: The Political Aesthetics of W.E.B. Du Bois. I am a political theorist, and one of the things I've always admired about philosophy types is that they are often very judicious and temperate in their writing and praise of others. But I think it important to have that as a backdrop when I read some of the blurbs on the back, where they say, Wendy Brown says that this work renders Du Bois among the most important democratic thinkers for our time and establishes Gooding Williams as Du Bois's finest interpreter. Tommy Shelby, who has tried his own hand at interpreting Du Bois's Philosopher, says that Gooding Williams is our most learned, probing, and discerning interpreter of Du Bois's philosophy. And Martha Nussbaum says that the book is simply stunning, so original, and so full of both close-knit arguments and provocative illuminations that there has been nothing like it in recent political philosophy. I want to share my own endorsement and just say what an extraordinary accomplishment. And it's a pleasure to be in conversation with you today, Bob.
Yeah, thank you, Brandon. Thank you. Uh,
Now, I wanted to start actually with another Du Bois speech turned essay, The Criteria of Negro Art, which he gave on the occasion of the NAACP's annual convention, where they're giving an award to the great Black historian Carter G. Woodson. And he gave this lecture on art and beauty at the convention. And he starts out with sort of fascinating provocation. He says, I do not doubt that there are some in this audience who are a little disturbed at the subject of this meeting, and particularly at the subject I have chosen. How is it that an organization like this, the NAACP, a group of radicals trying to bring new things into the world, a fighting organization that has come up out of the blood and dust of battle, struggling for the right of Black men to be ordinary human beings, how is it that an organization of this kind can turn aside to talk about art? After all, what have we who are slaves and Black to do with art? And you might take art as a stand-in for beauty here. Um, but the question is to you. We've got National Guardsmen fighting in the streets of Los Angeles. We have democracy arguably under siege. Harvard Law faculty saying that the rule of law and the constitutional democracy is no longer a settled question in America. We know why we're talking about democracy. Why are we talking about beauty?
Great question. I think what's important to see is that Du Bois is not coming to the question of beauty as an armchair philosopher. I think that the question he asks is one that perturbed me for a long time. And when I was giving the Shaw lectures on which the book is based, a series of lectures I gave at Columbia University, um, at the end of at least one of the lectures, I realized that people were asking me questions based on the assumption that Du Bois is an armchair philosopher asking himself, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions of beauty? I mean, what, you know, can as if he were trying to articulate a well-defined concept of beauty for all places and all times. And that's precisely what he's not trying to do. So what is he trying to do? Why, as I put it at the beginning of one of the book's chapters, why is it that Du Bois is interested in beauty? What is it that interests him about beauty? And I think the answer to that question is that Du Bois thinks that beauty is something real, it's something in the world. It is something that he associates with moral goodness. But most importantly, he sees beauty as constraining, limiting, contradicting, pushing back against ugliness, which he associates with beauty. So his conceptualization of beauty, his asking about the nature of beauty, is social and political from the get. Um, and what interests him is not to his interest is not to articulate a conception of beauty for all times and all places. Rather, he wants to ask, uh, 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 what makes beauty significant to us? Uh,
Hmm.
and this brings me to another, and so of course, then the question is who is the us? And the us is Black people, African Americans understood as oppressed, as an oppressed people. He's very clear at the beginning of Darkwater, a book he published in 1920, and a book that my book discusses, parts of which my book discusses at great length, that he's writing about beauty and any number of other universal themes from a particular perspective. From, he says, the veiled corner. And the veiled corner, it's his metaphor, if you know Souls of Black Folk, which I'm sure some of our listeners do, is his metaphor for thinking about the specific situation, not just the Black people in the United States, oppressed Black people, but of peoples of color generally. Because remember, Du Bois is now writing in 1920 in the wake of the world of the First World War.
Right.
He's uh, been he's thinking not only about oppressed Black people in Jim Crow America, he's also thinking about uh, uh, peoples of color worldwide, and against the backdrop of the imperialism which he believes caused the First World War. So he's looking at the world and asking himself, what can beauty do to again constrain, limit, push back against the ugliness of imperialism, the ugliness of Jim Crow, the ugliness of vicious assaults on Black life.
So, I mean, you've got this I think wonderful recovery of the standpoint in which Du Bois enters this larger conversation about beauty in the Western tradition. Um, and so we have a politicized beauty. We have a beauty from the veiled corner, um, one that's attentive to the kinds of unique questions that might emerge from this corner. And we'll get to some of those. Um, but at the risk of sounding like those armchair philosophers, I do want you to say a little bit more about what beauty is for him. Surely he's not trying to get it published in the Journal of Art and Aesthetics, but he's got a conception, and you're recovering and reconstructing the conception. And so, what for him is decisive about beauty? You said it's real in the world. What is it? How do we know
Yeah.
it when we see it?
Well, I think there are two features of beauty that interest him. One is completeness, wholeness, one might say, um, and the other. An event to count as beautiful has to have a certain completeness about it. Um, and it has to reveal new possibilities. But let me say a little bit more about that. I mean, I think what's really crucial is understanding that Du Bois's, uh, when he's thinking about beauty, there's a kind of paradigm case that he typically has in mind, and that's the case of A Beautiful Life.
Hmm.
And uh, uh, although, again, I don't want to suggest that that is the only sort of thing that he's interested in works of art, in visions, uh in political actions. I mean, all sorts of things, all sorts of events, I should say, um can count, or do count in his mind, as beautiful. To be more specific, beauty is very much a worldly phenomenon. It's not just that it's real. It's worldly. In some of his early writings, Du Bois sounds very Platonist. Talks about beauty as if it were a timeless, eternal, Platonic form. When by the time you get to Darkwater, he's thinking about beauty is as something essentially temporal, and that's why I think he thinks about beauty first and foremost with respect to the idea of a beautiful life. And built into that way of thinking about beauty is the connection he draws between beauty and death. Death is essential to beauty if you're thinking about a beautiful life. A ceasing to be is essential to beauty if you're thinking about other beautiful uh, 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 events. And so part of what he wants to say is that in order for a life to count as beautiful, when it's over, we need to be able to look back on it and to see it as a coherent whole. In the backdrop here, too, I must say, is I think a bit of what Ramper said described as Du Bois's Calvinism. I mean, there's a sense in which I think Du Bois thinks of life as born into ugliness, almost as if ugliness were something akin to original sin, and he suggests that each of us is tasked with overcoming the ugliness into which we are born, and we do that by making our lives whole. But it's also important that a beautiful light reveal possibilities, and the bar is very high, obviously, here. Reveal possibilities, unfamiliar possibilities that we might undertake in order to, again, to push back against, the ugliness that is otherwise, if not pervasive, all around us. So he has some examples. Alexander Crummell, for example, who was inspiring to Du Bois. And there are other examples that we could talk about and I talk about in the book. But again, the paradigm case is a beautiful life. I'll just stop there for now.
I mean, just really quickly, I mean, do you think I hadn't quite thought of this before, but do you think that that worldview, that approach to the question of beauty based on the archetype of a beautiful life, do you really think that's the impulse behind why he's so autobiographical? He's just constantly writing these autobiographical texts and narrating the long arc of his life.
I think that probably that impulse is connected to the sort of thing I'm talking about. It's important, however, to see that it's not always the autobiographies have a different tenor. So in Dusk
Mhm.
of Dawn, which is explicitly autobiographical, he says, well, it's really the autobiography of a concept, right?
Right.
Concept, and his life, he suggests, is significant just to the extent that it illuminates, the development of the concept of race. I mean, later when you get to the autobiography of W. Du Bois, it's more empirically rich, and more detailed than Dusk of Dawn. Um, and there's the Shadow of the Years chapter of Darkwater, which is also a very, very detailed. But yeah, I think he's always, and Doyce is probably one of these people who kind of, very early on, kind of realized that we kind of still be talking about him, that he was. I think he's one of these people who kind of probably thought that he had a lot to say, and people would see that he had a lot to say, and that and that we'd still be reading him and talking about him and trying to decide what his importance is for us. So he's helping us out by always providing us these narratives about what the significance, what the large, what the arc of his life looks like.
So you've given us this good view of beauty um, as trying to capture something about completeness and wholeness, having uh, engendering an experience or a new orientation toward being able to recognize something unfamiliar, something novel. Why does that matter for democracy?
Ah, good,
Especially
good.
for, those of us who have gone through the American politics sequence and we're learning about elections and campaign finance reform and the different branches of government. We're never doing aesthetics.
Okay, so
Uh,
good. No, that's great.
why
Although you
would that
should be.
matter?
Although you should be,
Yeah,
right?
right, right, right.
But I think one thing to think about is that Du Bois is, like Dewey, like other philosophers, any number of other philosophers, even radical critics of democracy, like Nietzsche, when they're thinking about democracy, they're not only thinking about democracy in a narrow sense as a political uh, 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 form, as a regime form, say. He's also thinking about democracy as a culture. He's interested in what we might think of as the culture of democracy. We have to distinguish on this point, between democracy considered as a kind of normative ideal, as a
Mhm.
standard of political excellence, let's say, and to borrow a phrase uh, that Nancy Fraser used many, many years ago. He's also interested in actually existing democracy, and actually existing democracy, the culture of, of actually existing democracy, as I say, my interpretive claim is that he thinks of of the culture of actually existing democracy, democracy circa, the decade of the First World War, and the decade of Jim Crow in America, or a decade of Jim Crow in America, as a culture that that culture, the culture of that actually existing democracy, democracy that Du Bois inhabited, um, as a culture of the mob, right? But there's another way of thinking about the culture of democracy. He thinks about uh, 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 thinking in more ideal terms. He's thinking of democracy as ideally, or the culture of democracy as ideally a culture of the crowd. And so that, of course, then raises the question, what's the difference between culture of the crowd, culture of the mob? And I think the key distinction is a distinction between a culture that is open to possibility, to difference, to hearing the voice of the stranger. Du Bois uses the figure of the stranger um, to use a phrase that is very familiar to us these days, inclusion. It's a democracy that is open to the possibility of including voices that have been otherwise suppressed or marginalized. So that's important because it's against the backdrop of his account of actually existing democracy, democracy where the culture is the culture of the mob, and where difference and marginalized voices are strangled and shut down. It's against the backdrop of that actually existing democracy that art has a significance, or that beauty has a significance. And in the book, I suggest that Du Bois distinguishes between natural and artistic beauty. And the argument, broadly speaking, without getting into any particular examples or details, is that artistic beauty, can, as it were, broaden our moral horizons. That is to say, it can prompt us uh, 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 to to be open to and responsive and how to put it, responsively open to voices and voices and insights coming from the veiled corner, voices and insights of otherwise marginalized people that in a culture where those otherwise marginalized people have been stigmatized, and where their voices have been thought not to matter. There's a way in which art can say, yes, these voices matter. You need to be attuned to these voices. And there's some complexity about how exactly that works, and we can maybe talk about that later. So that's one way in which beauty is significant. But another way in which beauty is significant is in terms of up until now I've been talking about artistic beauty. Beauty is also significant to the extent that it occurs in nature. So he's interested in natural beauty, and I think he thinks that natural beauty can again open us to the possibility can reveal the possibility of agency. Let me back up a step and try to, because I think what I'm explaining is a bit, I'm putting the point too abstractly.
Well, maybe we can.
Artistic beauty is directed against the white supremacist, and
Right. I was going to say, let's
and
get into that.
artistic beauty is directed to the white supremacist who doesn't take seriously those marginalized voices, who doesn't even apply moral categories to those marginalized voices. And artistic beauty can be functional in saying, look, right, you need to transform your conception. It says to the white supremacist, you need to transform your conception of what Christianity requires, of what morality requires, so as to understand that if you are a true Christian, or if you're truly a moral person, you need to um, open yourself to these voices that you've otherwise ignored, that you don't take seriously, voices that exist, as it were, outside the scope of your moral concern. If and then natural beauty is significant because I think he thinks that it's all too often the case that oppressed peoples can despair at the prospect of transforming the world, and natural beauty has a role to play in. I was talking about agency a
Pessimism.
moment ago. Natural beauty, I think, has a role to play in letting us see that agency, the possibility of transforming the world, exists where we thought it didn't exist.
Right. So let's focus on this first point about the struggle between, the role Du Bois thinks artistic beauty has to play in the struggle against white supremacy. And I should
Right.
be even more precise. One of the things I really love about the book is that following Du Bois, you really focus on not just white supremacy full stop, but the idea of an interaction between white supremacy as an ideology and religion, particularly Christianity. And again, to give our audience some background, I mean, he's writing at a time where, the Ku Klux Klan is in a moment of extraordinarily explosive growth. They actually captured a governorship of Indiana. You have race riots all across the country. Race riots when Jack Johnson wins the championship and becomes the first heavyweight champion in professional boxing. The Jim Crow regime, hundreds of lynchings a year that we know of. I mean, this is a violent time and a time of explicit white supremacy. This isn't, anything carefully wrought and that needs a lot of strong interpretive reading. These are people who say what they mean. And in the face of those folks, he thinks beauty has a role to play and fighting them off. But I guess what's odd about it, about the argument, is he seems to think that it plays a role precisely in speaking to the Christianity, right?
Mhm.
The
Yes.
self-conception of the Christian.
Right.
And I just would like to hear you. I want to invite you to say a bit more to the audience about how you're reading his take on white Christian nationalism, a topic lots of people are interested in today. And then maybe I'll have a quick follow up after you kind of lay it out.
That's great. Um, and that's very helpful. So um, sometimes when uh, people today even criticize white Christian evangelicals or white Christian nationalists, they argue that that the politics that such folk support is hypocritical. That the politics is at odds with the principle. That's not Du Bois's view. I think Du Bois's view is that uh, 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 something called white Christianity exists, and from the standpoint of white Christianity, lynching black people, um, uh, 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 it's just great. There's no contradiction between being a Christian and lynching black folk. And this is something, by the way, that the sociologist, and I point this out in the book, the sociologist, Orlando Patterson, corroborates. Uh, uh, and I'm blanking on the name of the Patterson
Rituals of Blood is the book.
Rituals of Blood, when he talks about a pastor who's also a Klan leader, for example. Um, Du Bois's view is this, that rather than say, look, you're being hypocritical, the point is that what has to be challenged, that what has to be challenged is the very conception of Christianity.
Mhm.
Um, and so, and that's a view that some folk, like my former colleague at what has to be challenged is the conception of Christianity advocated by white Christian nationalists, and that's a point of view that my former colleague Aubrey Hendricks, my former colleague at Columbia, takes. It's not about hypocrisy; it's about the way in which you all are interpreting Christianity. And now, Du Bois's view about art, it resonates with some of Isaac with some of Iris Murdoch's work, with some of Gadamer's book. The thought is that the work of art can challenge our moral self-understanding. I have a conception of what it is to live an ethical life, um, And I believe that I can live an ethical life and still lynch black people. And art of a sort can challenge that self-understanding. It prompt me, appeal to me to reflect on uh, my conception of what it is to be, in Du Bois' case, what it is to be a moral person, or what it is to be a Christian. And in the book, Du Bois has this interesting short story called Jesus Christ in Texas. And I think that Du Bois, and in the short story, the kind of work of art that's relevant is a kind of divinely crafted a work of art that prompts a white Christian woman to, as it were, transform her self-understanding. But I think that Du Bois thinks that the short story itself can do that. I think Du Bois, it brilliantly and quite stunningly in his discussion of John Brown's the 40 days, the last 40 days, I think, of John Brown's life, suggests that uh, 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 Brown's fellow Americans saw what was happening to him in such a way that, uh, uh, as a kind of theater, that transformed their understanding of what morality required of them. So the work of art doesn't have to be a religious work of art, although that's, the example that Du Bois uses. The idea is that, as a colleague of mine says, interpreting the work of Hans-Georg Gadamer, is that art can pull us up short. It can challenge our prejudices. It can challenge our way of thinking about things. It compel us to see things in a new way. And that's the kind of thing that Du Bois is after when he's suggesting that beauty can have a transformative effect.
One of the things that I think is striking about the works of art that you focus on, so again, a strange thing about Darkwater and a difficult thing for interpreters of Du Bois to figure out is why he's got these short stories all throughout it.
Mhm, mhm.
And they're very religious short stories. And the one you just mentioned is one where the Black Jesus figure sacrifices himself. And that's what occasions the transformation of the white interlocutor. John Brown also sacrifices himself. Um, what's odd about it is that it keeps coming back to that moment of Christian sacrifice or certain
Right.
kind of self-sacrifice. So I, I couldn't help but see King in those descriptions, right? Or
Mhm.
see the civil rights movement, the classical civil rights movement in those descriptions that
Right.
uh, what seems beautiful for Du Bois in these moments is a kind of disinterested self-sacrifice that can be carefully rendered. And that there's something about that when narrated, when dramatized, seems to occasion the kind of crisis of self-understanding that you're alighting upon. And I was just curious, A, if you think that's a fair reading of, fair extension of your point. And secondly, whether all of this kind of relies upon a shared set of Christian norms that no longer hold. And that if sacrifice is doing a lot of the work of the artistic power that he's drawing upon, might we be dubious that beauty that doesn't have that cultural matter at its disposal can do this work anymore?
Good. Great. I mean, yes and no. So when Du Bois is writing, I mean, he thinks that he's writing to, I think, white Christian America, writing to and about white Christian America. So he thinks that Christianity is very much a part of the culture, and that's why uh, Christianity plays such a central role in the argument of the book. And I think you're right to note the comparison to King. There's one of the examples I give has to relating to King. Concerns what happens in Birmingham, drawing on the work of our friend and colleague Karina Matana, who talks about what happens when the demonstrators kneel and the police see in them a certain dignity that
Mhm.
compels them to hold back from assaulting them. Um, And all of that, but even that example, and even though I think one can think about it in terms of the category of dignity, the fact that the demonstrators have to kneel and pray in order for their dignity to become manifest suggests again that religion, and religious
Right.
self-sacrifice is doing a lot of work. So so but that said, I want to suggest that what's philosophically interesting about Du Bois' position doesn't ultimately rely on the religious frame of reference. And what's important in that connection is realizing that um, there are other principles and concepts that operate amongst our day-to-day lives, that works of art can challenge in ways that resonate with Du Bois's argument. So one of the examples I give is the movie Moonlight, and I talk a bit about Daryl Pinckney's reading of of Moonlight. And Daryl Pinckney's reading of Moonlight is to say, look, there's a kind of operative conception of romantic love, um, not something you're going to look up in Webster's dictionary, but the kind of operative conception, the conception that is evident, I guess. And so he would say at the time, maybe in social media, in newspapers, in magazines, in film, in novel. There's an operative conception of romantic love that says big bad black men are not capable of
Right.
romantic love. But in the movie Moonlight, that way of thinking about what romantic love is challenged. And there's an analogy because what Du Bois is interested in is challenging a certain conception of what Christianity is, of what Christianity requires of it. And so other works of art can with respect to certain culturally operative concepts, challenge the aptness of those and invite us to say, we're operating with too exclusionary a conception of what romantic love involves.
Especially in places where, for whatever ideological reason or material investment, we have a hard time reasoning about them, where we're not responsive to the giving of reasons. We need to have our sensibilities changed in some way. Um,
Exactly, because arguably the giving of reasons always obtains against the backdrop of a horizon of conceptual possibilities. And so, if we want to, as it were, there's a way in which the capacity to reason is limited by the conceptual horizons in which we inhabit. Hence, the importance of sometimes of work that invites us to expand those horizons.
um, so speaking of expansive horizons, we only have a few minutes before I am compelled to open up the questions. I want to talk about natural beauty.
Hmm.
Um, and, you reconstruct this argument that Du Bois thinks natural beauty is a way for Black folks to ward off pessimism, right? The encounter with natural beauty seems to help steel some Black people for a greater struggle and restore and rejuvenate their commitments. And I guess, it's something intuitively plausible about it, but I confess it's the hardest part of the argument for me to accept. And so I just want to run through some worries
Right,
with you in the short time we have left. So
all right.
we'll both try to
So
be
So
swift.
full disclosure, it's also the hardest part of the argument for me to accept. I mean, I think it's so I sympathize with your skepticism. And you will remember that in that chapter of the book, after kind of working through the argument, what I take to be the argument, I consider a series of objections and try to
Right.
imagine how Du Bois would respond to those rejections, because it invokes the notion of the miraculous, that when we see a sunset, or when Du Bois sees the sunset, at Montego Bay in Jamaica, that that there's something about the beauty of the sunset that makes manifest to him the possibility of acting in such a way that would undo or disrupt or transform to some extent oppressive social relations. So why is it difficult? I think it's difficult because I think, in essence, because Du Bois is a romantic, and another way to put the point is that it's predicated on a certain metaphysics um, uh, that is at odds with the kind of determinism, um, and then echoing. But by the way, Du Bois is not the first person to kind of think about beauty as having this kind of significance, as revealing, our capacity for free agency. There, Schiller, not in aesthetic education, which I talk about in the book, but in um, something called the Briefe, kind of makes a similar argument that beauty, is a manifestation of something like a manifestation of kind of Kantian noumenal a manifestation of the apparent in the world of appearance, the world of appearances of noumenal agency, noumenal free agency. But that aside, what's I think most important, and coming back again to Du Bois's Romanticism, is I think the idea that Du Bois I think puts a lot of faith in our capacity, our shared capacity for imaginative perception. And the thought here is not that you travel and you go to Montego Bay or you go to Mount Desert Island in Maine, which is a couple of its examples, that you'll just automatically have this sort of experience. I actually think that he thinks that you have to exercise, like many of the German and English romantics. He actually thinks that exercising our capacity for imaginative perception is necessary in order to see nature in this way, which is to say, in a way that's at odds with the way in which we're kind of used to thinking about nature.
Right.
If we're thinking about the sunset according to the laws of nature, we can kind of explain it, and when it's going to, when the sun is going to set, and and at what angle and how long it's going to take to, you know, um, move from the center of the sky to below the horizon, and so forth and so on. But there's another way of seeing it, and seeing its significance. But in order for that to come to life, we have to again exercise our powers of imaginative perception. That beauty can reveal something about the world that we're not accustomed to seeing, but only if it will the what it is that beauty reveals, we will perceive only if we. So there is a fact of the matter, but
Yeah.
we will perceive that fact of the matter only if we exercise our capacities for imaginative perception. And there are, I think, as I argue in the book, you can place Du Bois in a kind of romantic tradition. There are some contemporary philosophical arguments that try to, lend some credence to this way of thinking about things. I'm thinking in particular about, and I invoke some of his work. Again, one of my former Columbia colleagues, Akil Bill Grami, as an interesting defense of what he calls natural supernaturalism, and which involves, on my interpretation, this idea that uh, uh, that uh, there are aspects of reality, aspects of nature that come into view if we approach the world in a kind of, sometimes in a practically engaged way. I think for Du Bois, not just practically engaged, but in a way, not just practically and politically engaged, but in a way that again involves exercising our powers of imaginative perception.
I want to let the audience know we're going to move to Q&A really shortly, so start submitting your questions. While I have I just want to make two quick follow-ups, Bob, on your helpful intervention here. So, um, one kind of odd feature of the argument, the natural beauty argument, is that you say, look, you've got to cultivate the right kind of disposition, the right exercise of your imaginative powers. That's why you, following Schiller, describe it as a kind of aesthetic education. We need to be trained to do this sort of work. Reading books like Dark Water presumably gets us some large part of the way. Uh, but Du Bois also has this thing where he says the pessimism that he's trying to ward off against is a form of cowardice,
Hmm.
vice.
Yeah.
Uh, why does he think that? That it's that particular vice,
Hmm.
and how would he respond to what any number of Afro-pessimists have said to me at various conferences and in encounters, which is that no, in fact, people like us, me and you, who go on about all of the various ways we might try to ward off pessimism and shore up hope and talk about infinite hope as I do, or tragic hope, that we're the ones who are suffering from a kind of vice of cowardice. We're the ones who can't look clear-eyed at the thing as it really is. Or if not at the thing as it really is, then certainly we can't make good judgments about what genuinely matters. That sure, the sunset is beautiful, sure, the vistas of Bar Harbor are beautiful, but in the grand scheme of the industrial slaughter of people of color around the world throughout the 20th century and the 19th century, the kinds of cruelties you see visited upon people these days, these things are trifles. And they shouldn't give us any sense that that the great battle before the Lord that Du Bois calls us to is one that can be won, or is even one that could be fought with any uh, sincere hope of a meaningful contribution or a dignified contribution. That the only really honest response is to pull away, to turn inward, to live clear-eyed about the hopelessness of it all.
Hmm. Well, I would want to distinguish between winning and fighting with in a way that involves a dignified contribution. I would not want to conflate those two, and
No, that's right. I want to make them separate.
I think that Du Bois uh, uh, wouldn't endorse the former, but he would endorse the latter. In other words, Du Bois is not about winning. In fact, Du Bois, repudiates, optimism of the sort as naive. He says ugliness will always be with us. He says that it suggests at one point that what we can hope to do is lessen its volume and its force. But there's a difference between saying that we can lessen its volume and its force, or its volume and its intensity, I guess, is what he says. Um, and saying that as it were, we can win. And so part of what I worry about is a kind of melodramatic imagination, and I'm inclined to say that the Afro-pessimist imagination is a melodramatic imagination that operates in terms of binary oppositions and is averse to complexity. I think the melodramatic imagination doesn't allow for the possibility of radical reform through incremental change, and that is because it's predicated on I think, a problematic a social theory, according to which there can be no significant change unless everything changes. I mean, it's a social theory that says, you can think about David Scott's work. It's a social theory that says that the only way forward is total revolution, which is let's say, the political analog to apocalypse, and that absent total if we can't an absent total revolution, nothing is to be done. And I think Du Bois, rejects that. I think some of the best contemporary social theorists, like Roberto Unger, rejects that. Social theorists in the pragmatist tradition reject that. I think that here, I think there's less an issue of moral courage, cowardice. This is me speaking more than Du Bois. Um, uh, uh, Speaking, so much as an aversion to think hard and carefully about complexity. I think, again, there is a certain kind of ease and comfort that comes with committing oneself to binary oppositions of the sort that uh, uh, lead you to the conclusion that either we win, or we lose. And it would be hard, and so the argument would be, it's hard to imagine that Black people are winning or could ever really, really, really win, in a big way. I mean, it's like, we go see Black Panther, but, that's not, that's good for, a Sunday afternoon and some popcorn, but, that's not going to happen. So therefore, and this is the invalid inference, therefore we're doomed to be, everywhere and always losing. And I just think that that's, a way of, that way of stylizing, conceptualizing style in a kind of stylized way, again, melodramatic way, Black people's experiences, Black history is just uh, uh, not attuned to real on the ground complexity. I think some of your own work about lost possibility, uh, there's a way of telling the story that leads one to a different set of conclusions. So one final point: telling the story, paying attention to detail, asking whether the details support this better support this or that version of a story is that's an important question to ask. It's not uninteresting from my point of view that at a certain critical point in the argument about pessimism that Wilderson writes, well, look, appeals to empirical considerations really don't matter here. What I'm really interested in is systematic structure. So as if one could, as it were, it's a kind of what philosophers sometimes call a self-sealing argument. It's as if one could somehow validly defend a social theoretic outlook
without any empirical.
without answering to empirically based considerations that argue against it. Now, maybe it all works out, my and my worry is that option, there's an attempt to cut off that option from from the get. I'm not arguing they couldn't have an Afro-pessimist point of view that entertain empirical objections and then defeated them, and then maybe I become an Afro-pessimist. But but that's not what I see someone like Wilderson doing.
Well, thankfully, we're not going to end with you being an Afro pessimist. We're going to end with Q&A. And we've got some great ones here, some that bring up some of the other things I wanted to get to. So I'll try to weave in. I hope you all don't mind if I tack on my little addendums to your questions. So we have one from an anonymous attendee who says, in today's lingering trail of postmodernism and cultural studies, not meant pejoratively at all, asserting the importance of beauty seems both politically and philosophically conservative, if not reactionary. And this is my addendum. One of the things that Bob and I talked about as we were preparing for this is the fact that the person who I note speaks most often and most relentlessly about beauty in public at present is Donald Trump. Everything is described as the big, beautiful this, we're debating his big, beautiful bill. We have his claim constantly that he's going to produce the most beautiful policy. The dogs that killed al-Baghdadi, they are described as beautiful dogs in his speech. It's beauty, beauty all the way down with this guy. And so, it fits this question. Do you not worry that the preoccupation with beauty talk in this moment leads in a more reactionary and conservative direction? And if in fact there is an aesthetic education implied in Du Bois's vision of beauty, this is back to the question, how far is our educational project from cultivating anything that looks like that? It seems as if we're closer to the kind of beauty that brought us Big Beautiful Bill than the kind of beauty that Du Bois is defending in Beauty of Death.
Right. No,
It's-
these are great questions. Let me begin with Trump and Trump's use of the term beauty, and then kind of circle back to the larger question. I mean, in that and in that connection, and to build on what the anonymous question asked, you might go so far, I think, as to say that what you maybe hear in Trump is something akin to, the aestheticization of politics that Walter Benjamin discusses in his famous essay of um, on the concept of history. Um, where Benjamin argues that when fascism aestheticizes politics, and I don't think he talks about beauty in particular, the category of beauty in particular in this connection, but what he says is that when fascism aestheticizes politics, it says basically politics is about self-expression. It is about fascism is about affording the masses a chance to express themselves without changing, without altering uh, property uh, 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 relations. Um, so politics is about spectacular self-expression. But of course, and of course, that's to some extent what we get. A lot of what we get, when a reality TV host becomes president. When Trump is um, before the election, right? He's talking about, he said, I didn't have to run for president. I could be on a beautiful beach, and with my beautiful body. Never seen such a beautiful body. Blah 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 blah. Now he's talking about when he talks about the beautiful bill. He's not talking about the beautiful bill in general. He's talking about my, you know, big beautiful bill, right? So I think he wants us to see the bill, as expressive of him, of his temperament, of his sensibility. He's invoking his own kind of charisma to somehow, invite us to see the bill as an expression of of that special something, that charisma, that beauty that he himself, in his eyes at least, embodies. And of course, to represent, himself and the bill in that way is, of course, to disinvite thinking about the bill, is to disinvite thinking about the particulars of the bill, is to disinvite thinking about, what the bill wants to do with food stamps and Medicaid and how it's
Right.
going to make a disaster of millions of people's lives. But let me come but now to come back to the more general point, I think what I want to say is that we shouldn't concede the discourse of art and beauty to what we think of as a conservative deployment of that discourse. I think all these categories are susceptible, just like the category of romantic love, just like the category of Christianity. All these categories are susceptible to contestation. And so, just as, it's important to say that's not what Christianity demands, just as
Mhm.
important to say that big, bad black men can be beautiful, so too is important to say that's not, that's not how I want to think about beauty. And let me tell you why.
Right.
So I think it would be a mistake to say, well, we can't talk about that because, that A, B, and C using these categories in particular is problematic and giving up the ghost. I mean, giving up the fight to the right. I think that no, a contestation, revalue, to use a term that's part of uh, that comes up in some of Wendy Brown's recent work, revaluing, you know,
Mhm.
values, which involves, questioning the significance that they are purported to have, and saying, no, that's not what they're about. That's not why they're important. There's another way of thinking about beauty. There's another way of thinking about Christianity. There's another way of thinking about uh, big bad black men.
So speaking of this revaluation of values point, we have another question from a brilliant political theorist, Hari Ramesh, who's at Wesleyan. Um, he asks about our present moment in the US and elsewhere. And he says that right now, times seem to be characterized by an aesthetic draw towards hierarchy and domination, right? And a particularly aesthetic draw, one
So
where
yeah,
people feel satisfaction when they witness state-backed cruelty to immigrants, or we see a kind of near deification of tech and business elites. And he thinks, or at least offers a suggestion, that a democratic response to this might be to revivify, as someone like Walt Whitman did in his time, the beauty of equality.
Hmm.
Beauty of equality. And he wonders if Du Bois gives us resources to do this. And I'd only add just a slight addendum. One reason to be skeptical that Du Bois gives us resources to do this is his well-known and oft-criticized elitism with
Right.
regard to artistic beauty, and is some of the worries that people like Henry Louis Gates have about whether Du Bois can appropriately appreciate beauty in the form of folk culture, popular culture, when it comes from people he associates with deviants.
Well, yes, sure. Great question. I think this is a problem. I don't want to say that there are no resources, but I do think that there is a problem. It's one thing I just want to, you know, uh, to preface my answer to the question and say a bit more about Du Bois. I do want to distinguish between the question, um, does a thinker offer us resources, from the question, uh, what does a thinker actually say about a particular topic? Because it might turn out that what the thinker in question actually says um, um, moves in a direction that is different than the direction in which we might move if we appropriate the resources that thinker appropriates. In other words, there's a way of appropriating the resources, of a thinker's thought that might lead us in a direction very different than the direction with which or in which the thinker, as it were, developed his thinking. So that said, um, I think in Du Bois's case, sure. I mean, I think a flip side, an anxiety, a worry that I try to address in the last book of the chapter is the way in which um, Du Bois's way of thinking about beautiful art can tend to a certain moralism, right? Because if the point, for example, of the kind of art that Du Bois endorses is to expand our horizons and to see, for example, that moral categories, let's say it's to kind of see the humanity of Black people, to see that Black people can exemplify moral virtue. Um, uh, uh, that big bad, or in the example I gave, to see that big bad Black men are capable of romantic love. That's all fine and good, but you might worry that the concept of moral virtue that Du Bois invokes is itself open to question.
Right.
Um, uh, and famously, as I talked about in the last chapter, Du Bois, when he's reading Nella Larson and Claude McKay, side by side, he says when he reads McKay, when he reads Home to Harlem, he feels like he has to kind of right, take a bath. It's so because there's so much deviance. It's very much at
Right.
odds with the Victorian moral sensibility. So I think that is a problem and something to uh, worry about. But that said, I think that um, the, I don't want to. I do want to suggest that there's a way in which, uh, uh, along the lines of some of the examples I've already used, that there is a way in which, a la Whitman, and I think there are affinities between Du Bois and Whitman. I mean, I talk about this a bit in some of the footnotes. I mean, drawing on some of Jason Frank's work, but I do think that yes, seeing democracy, egalitarian, but seeing democracy, seeing the demos, seeing inclusiveness as beautiful, seeing beauty as playing a role in promoting and articulating in concrete ways what we mean and understand and want to look and want what we mean by and understand an inclusive democracy to be. I think resources for all of that, we can find in Du
Mhm.
Bois, but again, and here. I'm coming back to the home, the discussion of Nella Larson and Claude McKay. Even then, we of course have to be careful because again, the threat of moralism never goes away, right?
Right.
There are all, there are ways in which, uh, we need to think about the scope and the limits of egalitarian um, commitments. And there's a way in which one can, parody, democracy and the egalitarian commitments that animate democratic political life that will render, a commitment to uh, equality absurd. And the point of those is to I think warn us against a kind of uh, 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 moralistic a conception of an unconditional endorsement of democracy, or at least let me not say of democracy, but of egalitarian commitments.
So, Bob, we are already running long, but I do want to say we've held the audience, which is, I think, a testament to the extraordinary scope and range of what you cover in the book and the depth of your insights. I did want to take one last question, if we could do it really briefly,
Absolutely.
Q&A, uh, which I do love. And would love to hear your take on. And you say a lot about it in the book, but there's a question from Aaron Greer who wants to hear your take on the famous debate between W.E.B. Du Bois and Alain Locke about art and propaganda, or art as propaganda.
Right. Right.
Which obviously will come up in any account of Du Bois's political aesthetics. That's probably the most familiar claim that Du Bois is
Right.
associated with, that all
Right.
art is propaganda. So, could you end by clarifying that move for us, and
Right.
weighing in a bit on how Bob Gooding Williams thinks we should think about the Du Bois Locke debate?
Yeah, I'm not sure. First of all, I should say, with a measure of humility, that I haven't spent as much time working on Locke um, uh, as I probably should. I have colleagues, and friends who worked a lot on Locke. The philosopher Leonard Harris. Um,
Mhm.
my friend Lorenzo Simpson is working on Locke in connection to Duke Ellington
Oh,
uh,
wow.
now, working on a book tentatively entitled, I think, "Listen, a Negro," and trying to think about Ellington and Ellington's musical aesthetics in the context of the Harlem, Harlem Renaissance more generally. There's also, I think one of Cornel West's most important essays. There's an interesting essay that Cornell wrote many years ago on the African American artist Horace Pippin, and
Mhm.
the way in which the I think it's kind of Cavell inspired essay, the way in which the category of the everyday and the ordinary animates Pippin's art, and Cornell argues that that's very much at odds with Locke's art, and he with Locke's Alain Locke's aesthetic, and he thinks the law. If I'm recalling the argument of the essay correctly, I think he thinks that Locke is operating with two kind of two conventional formalist an aesthetic, and loses touch with the African American everyday. Um, so all of that is an extended, effort to evade the question, because, I don't, which is to say, because I'm shy about it, because I just, I say at some point in the book, look, I mentioned the debate, and I said, but, this book is kind of about, trying to understand how we should think about Du Bois's side of, um, of the argument. Whether or not in the end, I mean, I have come across some literature. I can't think of the authors recently, but I've come across some literature, I think, recently, that suggests that maybe the divide between Du Bois and Locke isn't as great. That
Right.
they both want African American art to be responsive to folk culture, but at the same time, there's a commitment to formalism. We can find that in Du Bois, especially the early Du Bois in Souls of Black Folk. If you think of the sorrow songs, where he conceptualizes the sorrow songs as a developed and developing cultural form that is rooted, in the ethos and the spirit of the folk, that and that can all take us all the way back to African music, West African music, um, then maybe, from that perspective, the divide between Du Bois and, the Locke and the New Negro isn't as great as one might think. But that and but I'm not. I, the whole argument becomes more complicated when you bring Darkwater into the picture. People really haven't really thought hard about the work that the category of beauty is doing in Darkwater. They read Criteria, which comes out later, and Du Bois throws around the category of beauty, but he doesn't say anything about the nature of beauty,
Right.
in Criteria in 1926. And so people, write a lot about that. Paul Taylor's written about it brilliantly. Melvin Rogers has written about it brilliantly, but neither of them kind of thinks, well, what is Du Bois doing with the concept of beauty? And I think until we, and maybe, I think I have a reading on that. Other people may read the book and say, well, Bob's got it wrong, and that's great. But um, but until we come to grips with an understanding of the particulars of the concept of the conceptual specificity of Du Bois's, you know, um, first of Du Bois's come to grips with Du Bois's interest in beauty, and then second with how he conceptualizes beauty. Until we do that, I think we're not going to really be able to, say, in a genuinely illuminating way, um, uh, 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 what the relationship is between Du Bois's aesthetics and Locke's aesthetics.
I think that's totally right. And, I'm teaching a graduate seminar in theory for African American studies students. And this is a book I will assign, in part because I think it's a model of how to read the tradition. The close readings, the connections with other discourses and traditions, the attempt to make careful historical excavation speak to contemporary concerns, the illumination of tradition, but also because I think it brings such clarity to many of the things that we are introduced to as the constitutive debates of Black studies, but without having done some of the important conceptual work in the background that would make those debates fruitful. So sometimes we jump right into the propaganda question without really asking the prior question of um, what are these guys thinking about aesthetic values at all? What is their conception of art at all?
Right.
Uh, and so I think that's a powerful response. Thank you so much for this.
Can I say one more thing?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, because what's really important to see, we haven't really talked too much about Du Bois. Du Bois has, a theory of imperialism in Darkwater, and I talk about that in the book, right? And Du Bois is thinking about primitive accumulation, and Du Bois is thinking about primitive accumulation and imperialism can be compared fruitfully to Hobson and
Right.
Hilferding and Rosa Luxemburg, which I do a little bit. Um, what what's interesting about Du Bois at this moment is that he's trying to understand imperialism in relation to culture, right? And that's why, so all these worries about the aesthetic being, perhaps removed. I mean, from the politics and you were talking about Los Angeles and all the things that most immediately engaging us politically right now. I think it's important to see that for someone like Du Bois, thinking about beauty, so that's not, it's not, oh, I want to talk about culture and not about culture and politics go together. And
Right.
thinking about imperialism means thinking about imperialism, with an eye to culture, and in that connection, along the way. And I think some of the footnotes of the book, I say that what you see in Du Bois anticipates to some extent the kind of thinking that you see in Edward Said's Culture and Imperialism, or the kind of thinking that we associate with William Appleman, the famous American historian William Appleman Williams, who thought about the culture of imperialism. That's the
Right.
kind of thinker is Du Bois. That's the kind of thinker that Du Bois is.